Well, it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful to be here with you today, Michael. Your work on leadership transition, strategic thinking, and many other topics in the fields of leadership and management are nothing short of inspirational, groundbreaking, and immensely useful. I've used your work, referred to it generously and graciously, and I've read your books, and I have some of them here. You know, the first 90 days, of course, with your companion, Master Your Next Move for specific situations and scenarios we face ourselves in. And of course, your latest, The 6 Disciplines of Strategic Thinking. Look, many congratulations for your work, your contribution to management practice and thinking. And I'm sure there's plenty more to come, whether it's as an author, as a coach advisor, or as a teacher. And of course, we are going to delve into all of that work and more today. And I'm going to particularly ask you to draw out perhaps the unconventional, the surprising, the novel, the most stimulating aspects of your work. But before I do, let me welcome you to the show. Welcome, Michael.
I am delighted to be here. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So this conversation, I really want to delve into real life situations because you and I work in this space. This is not sort of just an academic exercise. I know you work with many CEOs and C-suite executives. And imagine we're speaking with one right now, and hopefully we have some listeners and viewers in this camp who are preparing for their next move. Perhaps they're in their gardening leave, they're thinking about their next move, or they're literally a few days beforehand. What serves them well in that transition period? What would you call out that they should focus on?
I'm assuming you mean other than reading the first 90 days, right? I'm kidding, right?
Of course. They've read it already. What should they remember then?
So look, I think a few things are important. I think the beautiful thing about not yet being in the role is you've got some time to do some learning before you arrive. But critically, you've got some time to think through how you're going to arrive. When I coach leaders, in that particular situation, I stress a lot that, the way you show up matters. And so thinking hard about, what's the presence you want to project when you arrive, what's some of the messaging you want to communicate, what are a few things you're hoping that people are going to get from you, about your leadership, planning out and sequencing the interactions you're going to have early. So it's that kind of stuff, right? And I think but it's a gift if you've got some time to really think about and plan your transition, before you formally go into it.
And how much homework do you think somebody should do in that situation? And I ask that question because I've seen the extremes where people do, there's the minimum, right? Obviously, you need to meet the sponsors, stakeholders, and so on, potentially some of the customers. But I've seen some people go, I would call it overboard, where they're literally loaded up with so many lots of thoughts and assumptions and, with goodwill. And others who sort of do the minimum and think, look, I need a fresh brain, unencumbered by this. I mean, what would you say? How much homework should somebody do in that period?
So like all great questions, the answer is it depends, right? And so I think you've got to be, thoughtful about the right balancing act. Look, I don't think either of those extremes are good, right? I mean, there is this tendency to say, hey, I've got a break. I'm going to, rejuvenate myself. Well, yeah, but there's so much advantage to be gained by front-end loading the learning and connecting work that you need to do to establish a foundation for a successful transition. So you don't want to miss that opportunity. I sometimes talk about the fuzzy front end, right? Because it can be variable in length and, it's not entirely clear, but you absolutely should invest significant, energy in doing that. Going to extremes, that doesn't serve anybody either because you create the wrong impression about yourself, right? Like this hyperactive creature is going to show up, and drive us collectively crazy. You're expending energy perhaps at a level that's not very healthy and probably not sustainable to do that. We can talk a bit later, about energy management through transitions because it's an extremely important dimension of all that. So yeah, I think, it's the middle ground is the right place to be. I should say though, just one on top before we go on, right? Which it does depend on things like, are you wrapping up an existing role, right? Even as you're starting to transition into a new one, right? And that's to me the worst of all possible worlds when you're caught in that situation, because you really should be focusing on your transition. You really should be focusing on how you can create momentum in the new role, and it's often crippling if you're trying to kind of clean everything up, or even worse, overlapping, right, with responsibilities. So I get up on my soapbox and sort of, yell and scream about, don't do that to people in your organization, right, because you're really setting them up for huge difficulty.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And also, people sometimes stay too long. It's like, I can't give it up. It's my baby. I really want it, and it's like, okay, stop, move on.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
getting a read of situations and the culture is so important, and getting a read of, I guess, how things get done. Again, that takes time, of course. But in the early days, how do you best get that read of the
Yeah.
organizational culture?
So I'm going to answer your question, but before I do, I want to just set one little piece of groundwork for the conversation before I do that, which is you need to be clear on what type or types of transitions you're going through.
Yeah.
Because the answer to your question depends a lot on, for example, am I onboarding into a new organization or a new part of my current company? Am I being promoted, right? Am I leading former peers? So there's, the situation matters. I was actually talking to a group of IMD alumni, about 50 of them last night, about this, and asking them about the last transition they went through into a new role. And I had a list of transition types they could check off, right? And I asked them, so, how many of these have you gone through? And out of 50, one person had had one person had had six types of transitions going on at the same time. And
Mm.
most of them were in the 3 or 4 range, right? And so I always recommend people get clear on what's the types and mixes of transition you're going through. And then I think you can get into the question of, how do I get up to speed? Because it helps, kind of focus
Yeah,
you
you're
on
absolutely
what
right.
you really need to be focused on. You mentioned
Mm.
culture. I think I believe culture is almost always an important dimension of transition, and that you should be focusing on culture almost regardless, right? Because these days, culture transformation is just so absolutely critical. I'm always surprised that very few leaders really understand what a organizational culture is. And to
Mm.
me, that's the starting point when I work with leaders around this stuff, is let's talk about what a culture is, right? Because you can't hope to learn about a culture, shape a culture, until you understand what a culture is, right? And I have this little model I use. I won't go into detail on it, but it's about the language of the organization, right? Every organization has its own unique language, its own set of acronyms. You need to learn to speak the language of the organization, and that's a part of the culture. The core frameworks that are used to shape thinking in the organization is part of the culture. When people think about culture, they often go down to the level of values and beliefs. And that's really an important piece of it, right? You want to be thoughtful about values
Mm.
and beliefs.
Mm.
But the real action is in the middle, which is behaviors, right? And I think you kind of alluded directly to this. How do we do things here, right?
Yeah.
I worked with the CHRO of a global sports equipment and fashion company, and she had a great definition of culture that they actually used in the organization. And it was what we do and what we don't do because of what we believe in, right? So she's
Mm.
linking
Love
behavior,
that. Mm.
but with that idea of values. And armed with an idea of what culture is, then you can start to engage in the learning journey, right? Well, what's the language that I need to learn? What's the real set of values that seem to be operating here? And that's typically not what's up on the wall, the list of five, magic
Yes.
words
Yes.
that. And then how are people behaving? What are people doing and not doing, and why? Yeah, because I think when you get then into culture transformation, which I do a reasonable amount of work on, the starting point is often around behaviors, right? If you don't shape behaviors, you don't shape culture, right? And then you ask yourself, well, what are the many ways you have to shape behaviors in the organization? So that's a pretty good start, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that definition. I think it's a brilliant start. I love the focus on language, and of course, all my questions should have the rider. It depends on the situation, the context, and so forth. And so they'll be overly generalist. But forgive me for that. I've spoken to many different leaders, management thinkers, coaches, and obviously have my own experience too. And when it comes to culture change, evolution, there's a camp which says, look, for big organization, it takes years, if not decades. particularly the
Mhm.
incumbents, the traditional organizations. Others say, yeah, maybe, but actually you can make a lot of change pretty fast, and not just in a crisis situation or a turnaround situation. What's your read on, again, a generic situation where you
Sure.
think actually there is a need for culture change? How long does it take? There's a simple, stupid question for you.
So I'm definitely in the second camp, right? Which is, that you can accomplish a lot actually fairly quickly if you know what you're doing. And if you go back to that model of culture about language, behaviors, values, and beliefs, reshaping the values and beliefs layer of the organization takes substantial time, right? You're not going to do that in
Mm.
less than 3, 4 years. It shouldn't take longer than that, but it's going to take that long. But you can begin to have impact on the behavioral level very quickly, right? If you're clear about sort of what are the target behaviors you're trying to, enact in the organization, how are people acting today? What are you going to preserve? What's good about how people are behaving? What are you going to change? Because you're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, proverbially. And then I think it's about what are the tools you have to shape behaviors, right? And a lot of it's about the incentive system of the organization. Yeah.
Yes.
The best predictor of what people do in organizations is what they're incentivized to do, right? When I go in and look at organizations, I'm often trying to see what's the full set of incentives, not just compensation and benefits, but how do people get advancement? How do people get
Yes.
recognition? And that gives you a lot of clues. And then I think, once you're clear on the kinds of behaviors you're trying to enact, then you've got to embed that in every system and process that touches people in the organization. Every
Mm.
HR process, every HR system has to reinforce the kinds of behaviors you want to see. And I think if you do that, within a year, you can have pretty substantial impact on the way people are behaving. Now, it's going to take time for that to infuse itself in, to be sustainable in the organization, right? So I'm not going to tell you that's the end of the story. I guess also changing the language of the organization is also something you can do, right? Introduce a new framework, right? In terms of how we're going to make sense of what's going on and focus our attention. You can, start to do that work actually quite quickly. Yeah.
Mm. And I guess the way you start or the work you do in the first 90 days says a lot about the culture of the organization you want to build. There are a number of organizations I know or I'm working with where they have the first 90 days. It feels like, frankly, a military exercise, and big tick for energy, drive, quick wins, and so forth. And the people in it love it. The people on the edges of it, or genuinely excluded, they are full of anxiety. And
Yep.
frankly, the central leadership teams that's an intention. They want people to feel a degree of anxiety. So I guess my question is around how systemic or systematic, I should say, a process should be in the first period. Obviously, there are steps, there are moves, there are sequences, but how much flexibility and openness should there be? It's not a free for all, of course, but how military should it be too?
So it's a great question. And I think I come in somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, I'm a big believer in the power of having the right processes to engage with the
Mm.
organization. Yeah. And I'll give you an example. One of the most important things you do as a new leader is assess and evolve your team into being your team. And there's different elements of that process, right? How do you systematically assess this group of people as rapidly as possible? There's process
Mm.
in doing that, and there's huge
Yeah.
value in getting a sense of who, and focusing not just on people but roles. What are the most critical roles in this team, and do I have the A players I need in those roles?
Mm.
And then what's the evolution going to look like, right? You've got to balance stability and change as you work with top leadership teams, because you can't change out everybody unless you're in a
Mm.
flat out turnaround, which is sometimes you make a lot of change in
Yeah.
situations like that. But in general, you've got to be thoughtful about the pacing and sequencing of the change you're making happen in the leadership team. You need to be balancing off performance versus potential. Like, you may be a really high potential person, but I need someone in marketing right now who can execute for me. So
Yes.
there's, and to me, I'm just giving it to you as an example, right? I think we could also focus very similarly on stakeholders, right? I like to see people being very, very systematic about mapping out their stakeholders and
Mm.
understanding what those stakeholders care about and beginning to be thoughtful about building alliances and asking themselves, whose support is make or break for me? This is something one of my coaches pounds away on, and I think it's a great question. Yeah. So I
Mm.
think there's a lot of process discipline that you can bring to thinking about how to transition. But I think you were pointing to something I think slightly different. I just wanted to kind of lay that
Yeah.
down, which is
Brilliant.
the intentional creation of anxiety in an organization. It's not generally a very good idea. People are already anxious. They're already wondering what this new
Mm.
leader represents and what's it going to mean for them. They're already concerned about, their futures and their employment. Do you need to add to their anxiety? And is it productive to do that? No, not really, right? And so I always recommend that people are as open as they can be, right? Because there are limits about what they're doing. I'm a huge believer in the power of sense making in leadership, right? Part of your
Yes.
job as a leader is to help people make sense of what's going on. And if you don't do that, then you're creating anxiety, resistance, and a bunch of other things completely unnecessarily.
No, I
So
agree.
that's kind
I
of where I
agree.
come down on that one.
No, I agree. I remember being in a room where a so-called leader literally said, "My role is to invoke anxiety amongst you as the leadership group," and somebody reframed it, said, "Do you mean setting high standards, challenging us, and supporting us?" He said, "No, I believe in anxiety." It was like literally mic drop. But
Yeah, yeah.
but imagine you've done that. What you just described. You have been
Mm.
systematic and thoughtful and deliberate, and then say 20 days in, you know you are managing your energy. You take a moment of reflection and think, what was sold to me is not anywhere close to what's in front of me now. What would you say to that individual over a coffee or tea?
Well, so first of all, it happens, right? I mean, it does happen that people find themselves in a situation that was substantially different than what they were expecting. Sometimes that's, intentional misrepresentation, but much more commonly, it's simply that, there wasn't full understanding of the challenges, right? We're hiring you into this new role. We don't think things are all that bad. We tell you you're there to kind of realign the business. You get in, it's a complete disaster, right? That kind of thing absolutely happens to people.
Mm.
There's also, I mean, I talk about onboarding into a new organization being hard because, recruiting is like romance and employment is like marriage. You during the recruiting process, we're looking good, right? And, I think you're wonderful and I'll always do the dishes. And I really like your mom, seriously, right? And then there's the cold, harsh light of cohabitation, right? And so one piece of advice I always give to folks is be sure you check and recheck and recheck your mandate once you're in the role.
Mm.
Be open to the possibility of the situation is not exactly, what you think it is. Because the worst thing is being in a situation and not understanding that it's different than what you thought it was. That's the
Yes,
worst, right?
yes,
The worst
yes.
scenario. Then I
Yeah.
think you've got some choices to make. And I think one is, can your hiring manager or the key stakeholders wrap their heads around the situation is different than they thought it was, if they were operating in good faith and really believed it was different, right?
Yes, yes.
And I think one of the things I talk to leaders a lot about is making sure that you're aligned on what's the situation, right? How serious are the issues? What are the priorities? But also on the how, right? How am I going to engage with the organization? What am I going to do in the first 60, 90, 120 days? And if you're not aligned on the what and the how, that's a big problem, right? And if you don't think you can get aligned on the what and the how, my tendency would be to say, okay, well, maybe I've got to make a very hard choice, right, about whether it
Yes,
makes sense.
yes.
And I think maybe final thought, which is, you always need to be asking yourself, can I be successful in this situation? Right?
Mm.
Do I have the resources? Do I have the support? Right? if you're on a a no return mission, then maybe that's not what you want to be doing.
That's such a great point. Many leaders focus on the tactical, the near term, the sort of the quick wins, and of course they're important. But this is a blend to your work on strategic thinking, which permeates all of your work, of course. When you're in, I guess, the most challenging situation, and I guess that's in the eye of the beholder in some ways, because I know people in turnaround situations who say, I love it, it's not challenging at all. But whatever your most challenging situation is, you've got to do the tactical, but you've also got to think strategically.
Yep.
How do you get yourself in that both frame of mind and then practice it in the first 90 days, particularly?
Yep. So again, I'm going to just divert slightly before I answer the question, right? Because you kind of alluded to something that I think is really important, which is what type of business situation or mix are you in, right? So one of the frameworks, as you know, in the first 90 days is the STARS model, right? Startup,
Mm.
turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, sustaining success. You know, the sense of urgency you bring to the work depends a lot on the situation that you find yourself in.
Sure.
If you're in a survival situation, then you're going to be making hard early choices that are quite tactical often, right? And only once you've kind of done the necessary triage and you've got and reasonably confident the patient is going to survive, then you can start going more into the strategic mode. If you're in a realignment or sustaining success environment, you need to be balancing from the outset the short term and the long term, right? Which I think is where you're going. Sort of one framework that I use for that, and it's really about balancing both strategy and execution, right? Is thinking in terms of distinct, almost time frames, right? Or focal points, right? Defend the core. Am I doing what's necessary to defend the core of the business? If so, then I can think about extend the core, right? What can I do to begin to push this out into other areas, leverage adjacencies, and then transcend the core, right? Can we begin to think about new business models? What needs to happen? And I find that if you kind of frame it in terms of those sorts of buckets, it really helps you understand what it is you need to be focusing on. So I think that's part of the story. I think part of the other part of the story too is this idea of quick wins, which you sort of mentioned. And I don't ever talk about quick wins because that kind of is sort of the low hanging fruit, paint the cafeteria, kind of stuff, right? And I talk about early wins, but I
Yes.
also, and there's a difference, right? Because early wins are, things that are substantive and help lay a foundation for the longer term, right? So you're not necessarily just grabbing whatever's available where you can get a quick win. You're thinking hard about, yes, how do I create a sense of momentum in the organization, but also how do I start to lay a foundation, right, for
Mm.
where I'm going to take the organization.
Yes, yes.
Underlying all of that is a critical idea, which is transitions are about momentum, right? They're about how do you create momentum in the new role.
I consciously use that quick win because I wanted you to call it out. I do know your work very well. I'm glad you do because it's about the positioning, isn't it, of and the momentum and how do you, if you are the person who can think strategically and practice it, but is around a group of people who frankly haven't been for whatever reason, how can you develop them? And can everyone be a strategic thinker?
So, really great question. I think you can give it a really good shot. So maybe back up, right? Which is, I think strategic thinking is to me, a combination of what's the mental machinery you're born with, right? Endowment matters, just like becoming a marathon runner, right? I was never genetically destined to be a marathon runner. I don't have the build, I don't have the muscles, I don't have the lungs to do that. But given whatever that endowment is, there's still a lot you can do in terms of experience, right? And in terms of the mental exercise regimes that you can use to start to develop your strategic thinking capability, right? And that's at the level of the individual. When I advise clients about developing their leaders to be strategic thinkers, I focus a lot of attention on, first of all, assessment, right? So identifying what are the strengths and weaknesses, because you can break strategic thinking up into important pieces. but the curation of experiences, right? What's the mix of experiences, mentoring, coaching that are going to really help develop that
Mm,
strategic thinker?
mm.
And then, I'm a personal believer in the power of mental fitness routines, right? I play 4 or 5 online games every day. I read the news,
Mm.
in a, I think an inquiring way to see connections and try to make things happen. And I think there's work like that you can do. And then I think you then go from there to what I think was the core of your question, which is how do you build strategic thinking capability into your organization? Because it's not
Yes.
enough for you to be a strategic thinker. I was on a call a couple of days ago, interestingly, with a very senior a CHRO, basically new CHRO, talking about how she is engaging her team, which had not engaged in any strategic thinking before she arrived, in the kind of strategic conversations. And a lot of it was just her taking them through a structured process of reasoning through problems, thinking through
Yes.
unintended consequences, and just keeping at it, right? And but also, and I think this was also implicit in what you said, having, devoting some space to doing that, right? Some time and energy to actually doing that with your team, and not be kind of the last thing we do after we've done all our other, work.
Yeah, I love it when it's practical and real and you actually have to do it as opposed to talk about it. Some people talk about strategic thinking beautifully and it sounds fantastic. And then actually the next moment they show that they can't do it for real or don't do it for real. Now, two developments I'll call out over perhaps the last 10 years. I mean, they go back some way if you look at history books, but ecosystems, many
Mhm.
organizations are operating in ecosystems. And of course, we're seeing the rise in application of artificial intelligence and not just
Mhm.
generative AI, and they've been around for decades, but they are more mainstream than they are. How has that shaped and influenced both your thinking and your approach to the situations we've been talking about?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I'm very much thinking about these things now, because obviously they're very current, right? I start with, leadership teams needing good frameworks to diagnose the challenges that they're facing in what are very turbulent environments today. Right?
Yes.
We can fall back to things like VUCA, and other stuff, but they're not really very actionable. And so one piece of work I'm doing is let's come up with a more actionable framework for thinking about things like the key dimensions of this. How do you get a leadership team aligned around understanding the core set of challenges that it's facing? And that can be shocks to the system. It can be technological, it can be socioeconomic, it can be stakeholder driven, but I'm really working on a framework that focuses on that. And then I think a lot these days about what are the core adaptive capabilities that organizations need to survive what's happening. And I should say, by the way, I don't know how we got so lucky to live in these particular times, right? But I think we're living in the most extraordinary times in recent, if not recorded, memory,
Mm.
right? And I think we're in for some very challenging things going forward. And so I'm trying to work with the clients and others that I work with to try and prepare them to survive and ideally thrive in this kind of environment, right? Which then gets me back to what do I think matters in terms of the capabilities that organizations need today? First and foremost, strategic thinking, right? Because if you're not recognizing, prioritizing, mobilizing, if you're not sensing and responding to what's going on in the environment, nothing else really matters, right? You're gonna you're
Yes.
gonna hit a wall. But then I think it gets into something you just mentioned, right? Which is ecosystem leadership and understanding that what you said is correct. Most organizations are not standalone entities anymore, right?
Mm.
They're part of ecosystems. They're operating in an ecosystem context. You need to think about how do you lead effectively in an ecosystem, right? How do you create and capture value as an ecosystem?
Mm.
I do a lot of work with a US based telecom company that has, I think, just absolutely mastered this, right? They provide sort of the software, core software platform and devices for thousands of rural and semi-urban broadband companies, right? So they've got like thousands of customers. but they've managed this as an ecosystem, right? They see these people as partners. Now they're the leaders of the ecosystem. They position themselves that way, and that's a great place to be. But they would never think of themselves as being a standalone organization. And then, so strategic thinking, ecosystem leadership, resilient organization, right? How do you design organizations that are more agile? And these days I focus a lot on adaptive culture as being the core
Yes.
of that. And then tenacity in leaders, right? Leaders are being overwhelmed. I mean, I have never had a time in my many, many years of practicing that I have seen leaders under more pressure than they are right now,
Hmm. I
right?
agree. I agree.
Sometimes almost crippling pressure, right, to perform. So how do we help leaders in a situation like that remain flexible and tenacious in the face of those kinds of demands? So that's kind of the big picture of
Yeah,
how
yeah,
I'm thinking about it.
yeah, yeah. On that last point, I mean, you referred to it earlier about personal energy management. What practices have you seen help leaders stay healthy mentally and physically in the most challenging times in order for them not only to live a good life, but also, frankly, make sensible, wise decisions? What helps the most?
So I'm writing right now the third edition of the first 90 days. And there's a chapter in the first 90 days that's about managing yourself through transition.
Mm, mm,
And when I wrote it originally, I kind of waved my hands at things like, well, you need to have, set priorities, you need to have boundaries, you need to all kind of, do all that kind of good stuff. But I've learned a lot in the last decade about this. And I think I now sort of organize it around how do you proactively manage your energy, right? Which is what are the set of practices you have that help you, sustain, what has to be during transition, substantial surges of energy, right? And what are the
yeah,
set of
yeah.
practices? What are the non-negotiables? And I mean, we've learned a lot about sleep, hydration, nutrition, exercise, hard during transition, but you still need to do at least a reasonable amount of that to not end up exhausted. Self-awareness about where are you on the stress performance curve is critical,
Mm,
right? If you're starting to hit off the edge of that and down into the danger zone, how do you know that and start to recycle yourself back? Transitions are times when derailers tend to show up, especially emotional regulation becomes challenging sometimes. So that, I do a lot of work these days helping leaders with their emotional regulation through these
mm,
stressful times. Advice and counsel, right? How do you make sure you've got the right network of advisors and counselors to help you stay, stay reasonably steady and with a reasonable perspective? So it's those things that I see as kind of the core
mm.
now, right, of managing
I agree.
yourself through a transition.
And the deal at home with partners, spouses, children, and so on needs to be clear. And candidly, I've seen a lot of good work there, and I've seen a lot of collateral damage
So
because these are all
you're
these
going
are
to
all encompassing
war.
rows. Yeah,
You're going to war, so you better have your family prepared for the fact that you're going to war. You're going to be
yeah,
away maybe more than usual. You're going to be traveling and working more. Your support system needs to be ready to deal with that reality and not in distress, right? I
yes,
mean, a
yes.
classic example of this too. My wife is also a coach and has done a lot of work over time on expat transitions, right? Which is kind of a special flavor of this.
Mm,
Congratulations, you've moved to Uzbekistan, but you're going into the office, and talking to your colleagues and on calls with, headquarters, and your family's living in Uzbekistan, right? So
yeah,
how do you? And I mean, I'm sure the best the biggest reason expat assignments fail is because the family is not
yes,
happy, right? So that
yeah.
notion of the support system and making sure people are really on board and understanding, at least to a reasonable degree, of what you're doing, I think is critical.
You talked about self awareness there. What about you? What is your biggest superpower?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I think that, I pride myself on having remained intellectually curious beyond the age and point where most of my contemporaries have done that.
Mm,
I pride
yeah,
myself on being able to connect the dots in ways that I think are, not I would say normal, but I have an unusual capability to do that and to create frameworks. I think I've got some courage in the sense of being able to confront harsh realities and not kind of just dive into a hole. And that's not easy sometimes, right? Because you look
No, no,
forward and you
no.
go, "Whoa, this is super hard," right? Or taking stands that could get yourself into trouble, right? I wrote an article on LinkedIn yesterday about let's not lose sight of the real meaning of equity.
Good
And I
for you.
called it out. I called it out
Yeah,
for exactly
absolutely
what
right.
it is that's going on,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
so,
yeah.
is that a superpower? Is it stupidity? We can debate the fine edge of that reality, but it's
Mm.
like those sorts of things, I think.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I can see that and sense that from your work. What about your weakness?
Taking on too much, too many ideas, too much turning sometimes around things. It's been especially acute since I started engaging so deeply with AI. I would, my son runs an AI HR startup in Toronto and tuned me into ChatGPT in November of 2022, right? And said, "Dad, you need to look
Brilliant.
at this." So I was the first faculty member at IMD for sure that was working with these tools, and now I work with them every day. But they're so amplifying of capability. I mean,
Yes.
I can write an article in 20 minutes, right? And it's a good article, and it's generated by me, but amplified by the tools. You can very rapidly get into this kind of absolute churn. And you also, I think, and I'm sure you know this, need to be very careful that AI doesn't make you stupid. You're
Yes.
reflexively going to the tools to be asking things. So, but I think that's focus is always a challenge for me, right? Staying focused, doing
Mm.
what I really should be doing and not what I happen to get interested in
Mm.
is probably the biggest challenge I face.
And as you are focusing, Michael, as we come to a close and respecting your time and given all the things you could be doing at a more philosophical level, what is the impact you're looking to have on the world around you through your work?
So almost 20 years ago, I looked forward into the future and got very, very concerned about what I was seeing, right? On a lot of different dimensions. I mean, ecology, technology, the socioeconomic, divisions in society. And so I've kind of been worried about this moment for 20 years and been thinking about what's happening now. And I don't think we're even close to the worst of what's going to happen. I don't want to be, pessimistic here, but I think, you know, and I think a lot about my kids and the challenges they're going to face, going forward. So, I think these days I think about my mission as being helping people survive and thrive through what are going to be, I think, extraordinarily difficult times, And if I can make a little bit of a contribution on the margin to that, then I feel like I've done something that's worth doing.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And you, from my own perspective, you have and more, and there's a plenty more to come. Michael, look, that was an enriching, stimulating conversation. We covered a lot of ground. You called out some of the nuances, the failings in my own questions, my thinking. I've loved it. I've learned a lot. Where can people find out more about you online when they
Sure.
want to learn more?
So best place is LinkedIn. And connect with me there. I have a newsletter called The Leading Edge that I post a lot of articles and other stuff too. That's probably the single biggest thing place to connect with me. Uh, Certainly the best
Wonderful.
place.
Well, thank you for your time, your wisdom, your good sense of humour and realness as well, which I appreciate. And that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the YouTube channel, the podcast, sign up to it. And if you're feeling especially generous, give us a 5-star rating. But most of all, thank you to you, Michael. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.